Last Tuesday, I woke up with tears on my face. Not from a nightmare, from a conversation. A conversation with a man who's been dead for nearly 200 years. James Madison sat across from me in that dream, looking smaller than I imagined, frail, even, with eyes that held centuries of exhaustion. He didn't introduce himself with grand titles or constitutional victories. Instead, he leaned forward and whispered, "They remember what I built, but they forget how many times I almost walked away." That single sentence shattered something in me, because I've wanted to walk away too. We all have. And somehow, this man who helped birth a nation understood that feeling intimately. Madison appeared to me first as a child, standing in the corner of a Virginia plantation classroom. He was 11 years old, trembling. "I had a stutter," he told me, his dream voice steady now but pained with memory. Not just any stutter, the kind that locked my jaw, that made other boys laugh, that made me feel like my thoughts were a prison I couldn't escape. He showed me a scene. Young James trying to recite Latin, his face reddening, words caught in his throat like stones. The tutor's disappointment, his father's concerned frown, the other students smirking behind their hands, the humiliation of being brilliant inside but broken outside. I watched him run from that classroom, hiding in the library, tears streaming down his face as he pressed his forehead against the cool spines of books he couldn't read aloud. "I spent 2 years barely speaking," Madison said, his voice thick with old shame. "I wrote everything down instead. Letters, essays, arguments I'd never voice. My family worried I'd never function in society, never hold office, never amount to anything that required a man to speak in public. He was overlooked even in his own home, the sickly son, the fragile one, the boy who probably wouldn't survive to adulthood, much less accomplish anything. But in that forced silence, something was forming. A mind learning to think in complete sentences, in structured arguments, in words chosen with surgical precision because each one had to count. He couldn't waste breath on filler or fumbling. Every thought had to be crystallized on paper first, perfected before it could be attempted aloud. The other boys learned to speak easily and think carelessly, Madison reflected. I learned to think with painful clarity because speaking was torture. Every word was earned. He showed me notebooks filled with his careful handwriting, arguments about government and rights and human nature, written by a 13-year-old who'd been dismissed as defective. "Weakness taught me precision," he said simply, meeting my eyes in the dream. And precision, it turned out, was exactly what building a nation would require. We shifted. Now Madison was 18, arriving at the College of New Jersey, Princeton. Finally, a place where his mind could run free. Except it nearly killed him. "I tried to complete 4 years of study in 2, he confessed, and I watched his dream self hunched over books at midnight, at 2 a.m. at dawn, never sleeping more than 3 hours. Candlelight flickering across pages of philosophy, mathematics, rhetoric, languages. His eyes bloodshot, his hands shaking as he wrote. "I had something to prove," Madison said quietly, "to everyone who dismissed me as too weak, too sickly, too broken to matter. I would show them my mind was enough." But his body rebelled. I saw him collapse during an examination, seizing on the floor while classmates backed away in fear. The college physician telling him he was destroying himself. Crushing headaches that felt like his skull was splitting. Depression so heavy he could barely rise from bed. I had what they called epileptical hysteria, Madison explained. Seizures, panic attacks, a conviction that I was dying, that my heart would simply stop. He showed me nights spent lying awake, terrified of sleep, certain he wouldn't wake. Days where the sunlight hurt and every sound felt like violence against his senses. I pushed myself to prove I belonged, and instead I proved I was fragile. He did graduate brilliantly ahead of schedule with honors, but he returned to Virginia utterly broken, convinced he had perhaps a few years left to live. For 5 years, he barely left Montpelier, his father's estate. He became a ghost, reading obsessively about government and philosophy and history, writing about ideas he thought no one would ever hear. "I was preparing to die," Madison said, his voice breaking, making peace with a short life. But I couldn't stop thinking, couldn't stop writing, couldn't stop imagining better systems of government even though I believed I'd never see them implemented. He looked at me with those ancient, tired eyes. I was preparing to die, but I was also preparing to live just in case. I didn't know which would come first. Then came the revolution and Madison was overlooked. Again, men like Washington commanded armies. Jefferson wrote declarations. Adams negotiated with foreign powers. Franklin charmed Paris. Madison, too sickly for military service. Too young for the major committees. Too unknown to matter. I watched history happening around me, he said, bitterness seeping through. I was elected to Virginia's Revolutionary Convention at 25, and I barely spoke. My stutter returned under pressure. Older men dominated every conversation. Patrick Henry with his thundering voice, Richard Henry Lee with his aristocratic presence. I saw him sitting in assembly halls, his amendments written out beautifully on paper, hands trembling too much to read them aloud. Other delegates would sometimes read his proposals for him, often taking credit. A man named Edmund Pendleton presented my Religious Freedom Amendment as if it were his own thoughts, Madison said. I sat 3 rows back, silent, watching my words change history while I remained invisible. The humiliation burned, but what choice did he have? His ideas needed voices he didn't possess. I was a ghost writing the future, Madison reflected, present but invisible. I'd spend days crafting the perfect argument about representation or rights, then watch it die in my throat when I tried to speak. Or worse, watch someone else deliver it poorly, mangling the logic I'd perfected. Yet he kept showing up, kept writing, kept refining arguments late into the night, filling page after page with careful reasoning that might never be attributed to him. Other delegates began finding unsigned papers slipped under their doors, brilliant constitutional arguments with no author's name. Some men began to notice, not his presence, but his ideas. Thomas Jefferson received a letter from me about religious liberty, Madison said. 20 pages of argument. He told me later it changed how he thought about the separation of church and state. A small smile crossed Madison's face. My voice couldn't fill a room, but my pen could cross oceans. Slowly, quietly, the ghost was becoming indispensable. Not through charisma or commanding presence, but through the relentless quality of thought that couldn't be ignored, even when its author could be. By his early 30s, Madison had earned a spot in the Continental Congress. Finally, recognition, except he arrived to witness catastrophe. America, under the Articles of Confederation, was dying. States refused to pay debts. The treasury was empty. Veterans of the Revolution went unpaid, some starving. Foreign nations mocked the new republic as a failed experiment. I watched everything we'd fought for crumble, Madison said, anger and grief mixing in his voice. And I was powerless. He showed me the halls of Congress, half empty because states wouldn't send delegates. No quorum to pass laws. No authority to raise revenue. No power to enforce anything. We were 13 separate countries pretending to be one nation. He proposed solutions, reforms to strengthen federal power, systems of revenue, mechanisms for resolving disputes between states, and was ignored. States' rights advocates shut him down. Northern commercial interests clashed with Southern agricultural ones. Everyone protected their own power, blind to the collapse happening around them. For 3 years, I fought for changes that never came, Madison said. I wrote letters to every influential man I knew, drafted proposals that died in committee, built coalitions that fell apart within weeks. I watched him argue passionately in Congress, his voice growing stronger with desperation, only to see votes fail again and again. The frustration was crushing. Spain closed the Mississippi to American trade. Britain refused to vacate frontier forts. Pirates seized American ships with impunity because there was no navy. Shays' Rebellion exploded in Massachusetts, armed farmers attacking courthouses, and Congress couldn't respond because it had no army and no money to raise one. I went home to Virginia in 1783, exhausted and defeated, Madison confessed. The dream was failing, and no one with power seemed to care about the plans of one small, sickly man from Virginia. He showed me himself at Montpelier, staring out the window for hours, hollow-eyed. I thought about quitting politics entirely, becoming a farmer like my father, living quietly, letting history happen without me. But even in defeat, even in exhaustion, something in Madison wouldn't let go. The question haunted him. Could 13 broken pieces ever become one whole nation? But he couldn't let go. In 1786, Madison spent months locked in his study, reading every book on government he could find: ancient democracies, modern republics, failed states and successful empires, Polybius on Rome, Montesquieu on separation of powers, histories of the Dutch Republic, the Swiss Confederation, every league and alliance that had ever tried to unite independent states. I read like a man possessed, he told me, because I knew we'd get one more chance. Just one. He filled notebooks with observations, patterns of failure, mechanisms of success. What made governments stable? What destroyed them? How could you balance power between large and small, rich and poor, federal and local? That chance came in Philadelphia, 1787. The Constitutional Convention. Madison arrived early with a plan, the Virginia Plan, a complete restructuring of American government. 3 branches, checks and balances, a powerful legislature with proportional representation. I thought if I came prepared enough, organized enough, they'd have to listen. And then the fighting began. Large states versus small states screaming about representation. Northern commercial interests versus Southern slavery. Nationalists versus states' rights defenders who wanted barely any federal government at all. Every single day, I thought the whole thing would collapse, Madison said, his dream self pacing the halls of Independence Hall, drenched in sweat from Philadelphia's suffocating summer heat. For 4 months, through temperatures over 90 degrees in a sealed room, we argued. I spoke more in those months than I had in my entire life. His stutter mostly stayed buried, overridden by sheer necessity. He debated, negotiated, compromised, fought. I watched him lose battles. Equal representation in the Senate crushed his proportional vision. The 3/5 compromise, counting enslaved people as partial humans for representation, made him physically ill. I hated it, he said quietly, shame washing over his face. The slavery compromises. I knew they were morally bankrupt, but I believed a flawed union was better than no union at all, better than dissolution and probable war between the states. He looked at me with anguish. I've questioned that choice ever since. Every single day since. The Constitution was written. Now it had to be sold. And much of America hated it. Anti-federalists attacked it as tyranny in disguise, a return to the monarchy they'd just escaped. State conventions rejected it. Madison's home state of Virginia, crucial for ratification, seemed ready to vote no. Without Virginia, the whole thing would collapse. This was worse than writing it, Madison said. Now I had to defend every compromise I'd hated, every imperfect clause, every gap and weakness I knew existed. Alongside Hamilton and Jay, he wrote the Federalist Papers, pumping out essays at a crushing pace, explaining and defending and persuading through newspapers that reached every state. I wrote Federalist 10 in one sitting, he told me, about factions and representative government and how a large republic could actually protect liberty better than small ones. People call it genius now. Then, I wasn't sure anyone would read it past the first paragraph. He showed me himself writing by candlelight, ink-stained fingers cramping, racing against publication deadlines while critics called him a traitor to revolutionary principles. At Virginia's ratifying convention in June 1788, he faced Patrick Henry, the greatest orator in America. Henry's voice could shake buildings, move crowds to tears or rage. Madison's was still quiet, sometimes cracking under strain. I had facts and logic. He had thunder and passion, Madison said. For 3 weeks, I thought thunder would win. Henry painted apocalyptic visions of federal tyranny, of Virginia's rights crushed, of a president becoming king. Madison responded with careful constitutional analysis, explaining structures and mechanisms in his soft, methodical voice. The room was packed, sweltering. Madison spoke for hours across multiple days, ignoring his body's weakness. Every night I thought I'd failed, he confessed. Henry was magnificent. I was thorough, but thorough was enough. Barely. Virginia ratified by just 10 votes, 89 to 79. 10 votes, Madison repeated, the weight of it crushing. The entire framework of American government survived by 10 votes. Everything, the Constitution, the federal system, the republic itself, came within 5 votes of meaning absolutely nothing. Madison didn't want a Bill of Rights initially. He thought the Constitution as written was sufficient, that listing rights might imply the government had powers it didn't actually possess. But he'd promised amendments to secure ratification, and Madison kept his promises even when they haunted him. I spent 1789 sifting through over 200 proposed amendments from the states, he said, showing me stacks of contradictory demands covering his desk. Some wanted to undo the whole Constitution. Some wanted to protect slavery more explicitly. Some wanted to ban standing armies or limit federal taxation to nothing. Many were designed to cripple the government we just created. He had to craft amendments that protected genuine rights without destroying the federal structure he built. It was like threading a needle while wearing gloves. Freedom of speech, religion, press, essential. The right to bear arms, controversial but necessary for ratification. Protections against unreasonable searches, self-incrimination, cruel punishment, fundamental to liberty. But the first Congress didn't want to deal with it. They had tariffs to debate, executive departments to establish, a government to actually run. They thought I was wasting time on unnecessary additions, Madison said. Some called me obsessive. Others accused me of trying to weaken what we'd built. He forced the issue anyway, draft after draft, debate after debate, insisting the floor take up amendments when they wanted to move on. I became annoying, he admitted with a slight smile. Relentlessly, persistently annoying. I gave speech after speech about honoring our promises to the people. He whittled 200 amendments down to 17, which Congress trimmed to 12, and the states ratified 10. The Bill of Rights, protections now considered sacred, fundamental to American identity. It secured my legacy, Madison reflected. Historians call it my greatest achievement. But at the time, most people thought I was wasting everyone's time on redundant additions to an already complete document. He looked at me directly. Sometimes your most important work feels like a pointless fight. You do it anyway, not because people appreciate it then, but because it's right, because you promised, because someone has to care about the details everyone else dismisses. Through all of this, Madison had one constant ally, Alexander Hamilton. They'd written the Federalist Papers together, fought for ratification side by side, built the new government as partners. Hamilton brilliant and ambitious, Madison methodical and principled. They trusted each other completely, until they didn't. Hamilton's financial system betrayed everything I believed in, Madison said, pain evident in every word. Federal assumption of state debts, a national bank, funding schemes that enriched northern speculators at southern expense, concentrating power in financial elites exactly like the British system we'd fought to escape. I watched their friendship shatter over policy. What began as private disagreements became public arguments. Congressional debates where they attacked each other's proposals. Bitter newspaper essays under pseudonyms, each knowing who wrote the other's criticisms. Political parties forming around their divide. Hamilton's Federalists versus Madison and Jefferson's Democratic Republicans. We'd been brothers in revolution, Madison said, his voice breaking. We created this government together, and now we were tearing at each other over how to run it. The personal betrayal cut deeper than policy differences. Hamilton accused Madison of inconsistency, of abandoning nationalist principles. Madison saw Hamilton building the aristocratic system they'd overthrown. Their last private conversation was cold, formal, devastating. He told me I'd become a tool of Jefferson's ambition, Madison said. I told him he'd become what we'd fought against. We both meant it. We were both partly right. The isolation was crushing. Madison had few close friends. His reserved nature, his health, his intellectual intensity kept most people at distance. Hamilton had been different. They'd understood each other's minds, finished each other's constitutional arguments, shared the burden of building something impossible. I aligned with Jefferson instead, Madison continued. But that partnership was different. Jefferson was the visionary, the public face, the voice. I was the strategist behind his vision, the one who made his ideas work. Always the junior partner. He looked at me with ancient sadness. I lost Hamilton and found a new role. The work continued. The Republic survived our split. But I never stopped missing what we'd had. That brief moment when two men understood each other completely and built a nation from that understanding. In 1808, Madison became president almost by default. Jefferson's chosen successor, the logical next step everyone expected. I'd spent decades in backrooms crafting policy, he said. Suddenly I was the face of the nation, and I was terrible at it. The dream showed me a Madison overwhelmed by executive responsibility, uncomfortable with the ceremonial aspects, struggling to command presence in a role that required it. The looming war with Britain, trade embargoes that destroyed the American economy, a divided cabinet full of men who didn't respect him, a military completely unprepared for conflict. Everything I'd built seemed to be failing, he said, watching problems multiply faster than solutions. Then came the War of 1812. Madison's war, though he'd tried desperately to avoid it. Except he couldn't manage it. Poor generals, inadequate supplies, state militias refusing federal orders. The British invaded with barely any resistance. Washington itself fell. The Capitol burned. The White House burned. Madison and Dolly fled like refugees as enemy troops torched the city. I stood on a hill in Virginia watching the fire, Madison said, tears streaming down his dream face. The great experiment in Republican government, the Constitution, everything we'd built, going up in smoke. Because of decisions I made. Because I wasn't strong enough, wasn't capable enough to be what the moment required. He wanted to resign, to disappear into the disgrace he deserved. The humiliation felt unbearable, the father of the Constitution presiding over its destruction. But Dolly wouldn't let me, he said softly, something like awe in his voice. She saved Washington's portrait from the flames. She rallied the displaced government. She told me that symbols matter, that we'd rebuild, that failure isn't final unless you surrender to it. Somehow, improbably, America survived the war, won some battles, held some ground, negotiated a face-saving peace. The nation emerged intact, even strengthened in strange ways. But Madison's reputation was permanently complicated. History remembers me for the Constitution, he said quietly. But I remember the fires. I remember failing when it mattered most. In the dream's final moments, Madison and I sat in his retirement at Montpelier. He was old now, in his 80s, crippled with arthritis, hands too gnarled to write the letters that had once been his power. He watched from his porch as a nation grew beyond anything he'd imagined, states stretching westward, industries rising, democracy expanding in ways both thrilling and terrifying. They call me the father of the Constitution, he said, but I was one architect among many, and half of what I designed has been changed or ignored or interpreted in ways I never intended. He gestured weakly at the landscape. The nation I helped create is becoming something I barely recognize. I don't know if that's failure or success. I asked him what he wanted people to remember. Madison was quiet for a long time, the silence stretching between us like the years he'd lived. Remember that great things are built by flawed people who wanted to quit, he finally said. I was overlooked, sickly, doubtful, often wrong. I made compromises that haunt me. I failed as often as I succeeded. I was never the smartest man in the room, never the most charismatic, never the natural leader. He leaned closer, his eyes fierce despite their age. But I stayed in the room. I kept writing when no one listened. I kept arguing when my voice failed. Not because I was confident, I rarely was, but because the alternative was giving up, and I couldn't live with that. Most days I felt small and insufficient, but I showed up anyway. As the dream began to fade, Madison smiled. Tired, genuine, profoundly human. "You feel overlooked too," he said. "I can see it in you. That's why I came tonight. To tell you that the overlooked ones sometimes change everything. Not because they're extraordinary, not because they're blessed with natural gifts, but because they refuse to stay invisible forever. Because they keep working when no one's watching. Because showing up again and again is its own kind of revolution.